My next speaker is Deirdre Boyes. Deirdre grew up in Africa. It left her with a fascination, not just for that continent, but its environs, and also for the legendary, the quirky and the human aspects, as you will discover when she shares. Deirdre, your turn.
Thank you, Mike. The map that I'm presenting is a small map of St. Helena that was produced shortly after Napoleon arrived on the island on the 15th of October, 1815. He remained there until his death in May 1821. I'd like to credit the St. Helena information website for a lot of the information that I'm presenting actually came from that website. So this is the map that it's based on. This was produced by Robert Reed the year before, so 1815, and engraved by Robert Kirkwood. We can have the
next. Okay,
next
just
slide,
let me know.
please.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is my map. It's not the prettiest, and it's a bit stained, but the reason I'm presenting it is I love the human element in this map. The map depicts a lot of the sort of houses and places that were on St. Helena at the time Napoleon was there, and also the individuals living in them. St. Helena is a small island. It's only about 8 by 16 kilometers in size. And in 1817, the census reported just over 6,000 individuals living on the island. So I suspect that all the big landowners would have known each other fairly well. There are going to be 4 areas that we'll look at in a bit more detail. One is the area around Jamestown, which is in the sort of middle of the map at the bottom. And this is the place that Napoleon landed. Now, the ship actually docked on the 15th of October, but Napoleon remained on the ship until the 17th. And they decided to take him off at night because such a large crowd had gathered and had been there for 2 days. They were hoping that they'd all dispersed at night, but actually they were still there waiting for him. He spent the first night in the home of a Mr. Henry Porteous, which we think is just behind the castle in the area that Tom's indicating. He ran a guest house, which was in a Georgian building that was destroyed by fire in 1862. And he was also the superintendent of the East India Company Gardens at the time. I can have the next slide, please. This slide depicts the areas that Napoleon lived in. So the day after he stayed with Mr. Porteous, he went on a sightseeing tour and came across a place called Briar's Pavilion, which was in the grounds of Briar's house. The Balcombe family lived in Balcombe House, and Tom's indicating where it is on the right. And Napoleon actually asked if he could stay there whilst Longwood House was being prepared for him. Longwood House is over on the left. So he remained with the Balcombes until December of that year and developed quite a friendship with the family, but in particular with little Betsy Balcombe, who was 13 years of age at the time. Now, Betsy was the only family member who could speak French. The family remained on the island until 1818. And in 1840, Betsy wrote her memoirs about her time with Napoleon on the island. So we know a lot about what they knew of Napoleon. William actually acted as the provisioning officer for Napoleon. And then in December of that year, Napoleon moved into Longwood House, where he remained until his death. And what I love about this map is the row of cannons pointing towards Longwood House, which I think was indicating the security that was around Napoleon at the time. Another friendship that Napoleon struck up was with a slave called Toby. Toby was the chief gardener of the Balkan Gardens and was brought to the island in 1803. Now, his enslavement was likely to be illegal because an act had been passed in 1792 that stated that no new slaves could be brought to the island after that date. He lived in a two-room building with another 20 slaves on the Balkan estate. When Napoleon left the Briars, he gave Toby the £15, which in those days would have been a huge amount of money. And the reason he gave it was for Toby to buy his freedom. Now, unfortunately, what Toby did was he put the money under his bed, and in 1822 it was stolen. Another slave called Sam was tried and subsequently executed, but the money was never found again. So poor Toby lost his freedom money. Napoleon also tried to bring the case of Toby to the authorities on the island, pointing out that the enslavement was illegal. And although an investigation was carried out, neither Toby or any of the other 8 slaves affected was actually freed. If I can have the next slide, please. Now, this slide depicts Plantation House in the center of the map. And Plantation House is the residence of the governor of St. Helena. At the time Napoleon went onto the island, the governor was Mark Wilkes, but very quickly after that, Hudson Lowe was brought in specifically to oversee Napoleon's exile. Now, despite the length of time that Napoleon was on the island, Lowe only met him a handful of times. He was described as being a fairly abrupt, reserved character, and he made life for Napoleon quite difficult. He put rules in place with regards to where he could travel on the island, how much firewood he could have, and it dictated that he should be dressed as general rather than by his title. The other thing I'd like to point out here is the home of Reverend Richard Boys, who I hasten to add is not a relative. He was on the island by 1808, and in 1815 was the senior chaplain. And his house is called Kent House, and it still stands today. He was described as a spectacularly difficult character and a turbulent priest, and he clashed with the authorities. Now, one of the things he did was he recorded in the parish register the names of the men who had fathered children with slave women. And during his time on the island, the proportion of illegitimate births decreased quite rapidly. So in 1813, 197 of 296 births were illegitimate, which was about 2/3 of the number. By the time he retired in 1829, he'd reduced that number to 1 out of 178, a grand total of 0.6% of the births. The other thing I'd like to point out is the botanical gardens, just above Plantation House. They were created by a gentleman called Richard Burchell, who was an artist and also worked at Kew Gardens in London. And he was described as one of the most prolific collectors of botanical and zoological specimens. He actually went out to St. Helena in the company of William Balcombe, and they formed a partnership which broke down shortly after they arrived. He had a rather unfortunate time in St. Helena. The next person who took over running the botanical gardens unfortunately didn't appreciate them and didn't support him, but he hung on waiting for his fiancée to arrive. And when she arrived, it was a lady called Lucia Green. She arrived in 1807, promptly announced that she was marrying the ship's captain and sailed away. He eventually moved to Cape Town in 1810 and became the botanist for the Cape Colony. The final slide. The area to the east of the island was predominantly owned by the Mason family. And in the upper sort of left-hand corner, there's a lady called Miss Mason at Orange Grove. She was a rather strange character. She used to ride around on an ox, and she would bow effusively whenever she saw Napoleon. Birchall described her house as one of all the rude, uncouth, rocky, barren, untempting structures for a house. This is the strangest and most remarkable of any of I have yet seen. And again, that house is still there, although in a state of disrepair. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's all rather Gothic. Everything you've described. It didn't make me want to live in St. Helena, although I did want to go climbing when I saw the Colorado Rockies. Thank you very much, Deirdre.
Thank you.
We've run out of time on questions, I'm afraid. So please use the mechanism of chat.